I signed the deed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in an office that smelled like forgotten paper and old men's coffee. The lawyer, Mr. Harmon, was one of those faces that looked like it had always been there. Eyes like stagnant pond water, handshake too soft. He left it to you because no one else wanted it, he said, as if that were a kindness. No one's set foot on the property since 1946. Just needs a little love. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside were the keys, a survey map curled at the edges, and a single black and white photo clipped to the corner. A house 2 stories, wide porch, dark windows. A farmhouse fossilized in time. I didn't even know I had a great-uncle, let alone one who had owned a piece of property out in Vermont. I asked about him casually over the phone with my mother that evening, and got only the rustling sound of her breathing and a change of subject. "How's work?" she said, and I let her veer off. Some walls don't have doors. 3 days later, I drove up alone, cutting through winding roads under a low gray sky. The property sat on the outskirts of a town called Lindrow Hollow, a name that sounded invented. There were no welcome signs, no gas stations, not even a diner. Just an old post office that looked permanently closed and a scattering of homes with porches collapsing into the earth. My cell signal had vanished an hour earlier. When I turned onto the gravel drive, the trees gathered closer. Oaks, birches, a few sickly pines, crowding the dirt road like silent witnesses. The farmhouse appeared slowly, framed between the branches like something that had been waiting. Paint peeled in wide strips along the siding. The porch sagged on one corner, where the foundation had surrendered to decades of snow and silence. I stepped out of the car, and the air smelled like wet stone and mold. It was the quietest place I had ever been. The key fit stiffly in the front door. The lock turned with a groan, and the door opened on a breath of air that hadn't moved since Truman was president. I stepped inside and had the immediate, unnerving feeling that I had just interrupted something. The interior was dust and stillness. Furniture still stood in place, a small floral couch with a crocheted throw folded neatly across the back, an end table with a lamp and a half-melted candle. The floor creaked softly underfoot, as though remembering each step it had ever carried. I ran my hand across the surface of the upright piano near the wall. It left a streak, a clean line through a quarter-inch of dust. In the kitchen, there were dishes stacked neatly in the sink, and a chipped mug still held a fossilized ring of coffee. The refrigerator was ancient and unplugged. A calendar on the wall read June 1946. The days were all crossed out with red pencil up to the 20th. The 21st was circled twice, but left blank. Upstairs, the bedrooms had that strange, preserved feeling, like the air had been vacuum sealed in 1946 and hadn't escaped since. There were clothes still in the drawers, photos on the wall, a child's wooden toy on the windowsill. I found a trunk at the foot of one bed and opened it to find foldable blankets, an old doll with one eye missing, and a neatly bundled stack of letters tied with twine. I didn't read them yet. They felt too personal, as if the moment I opened one, the whole house would know. I stayed on the first floor that night, laid out my sleeping bag on the couch, and lit a few candles. I didn't bring much, just a change of clothes, a few groceries, and my journal. It wasn't until after midnight that I noticed the absence of sound. No wind, no insects, not even the creaking of the house settling. Just an oppressive, all-encompassing stillness, like the house was listening. Sleep came lightly and broke often. I dreamed of footsteps upstairs. In the dream, I rose and walked through the dark, found a man seated in the hallway, writing in a notebook. He didn't look up. I couldn't see his face, only his hand moving over and over. The same word again and again. Thomas. I woke with a name in my mouth, unsure whether I had spoken it aloud. In the morning, the fog was thick enough to erase the driveway. I made coffee with bottled water on a camp stove and stood on the porch, listening to the trees. I noticed then that the mailbox flag was up, though I hadn't touched it. Inside was a yellowed envelope with no stamp, just my name in blocky handwriting. "To be opened only if you return," it said. I opened it anyway. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, written in that same blocky scrawl. "If you are reading this, the house knows your name. It does not forget. Leave now and seal the door. If you stay, do not open the pantry." I reread the note 3 times. It felt like a prank, but who would have known I was coming? Harmon, my mother. No one else even knew this place existed, let alone had access. I walked back inside slowly, the floor moaning under my weight. The kitchen was unchanged. The pantry stood at the far end, next to the back door. Just an old wooden door with a rusted latch. I didn't touch it. Not then. Instead, I opened my notebook and started to write. I needed to track what I was seeing, what I was feeling. I titled the page Day 1, but when I reached the bottom corner to mark the date, I stopped. I hadn't noticed it before, but each page of the notebook already had a name printed faintly in the corner. Thomas. Not a manufacturer's mark. Not my writing. Just the name, small and faded like it had always been there. I closed the notebook slowly and set it aside. The air in the house felt heavier now. Charged. The kind of weight that presses in from every side. I told myself it was just age, just the isolation. That was the last time I truly believed that. That evening, I heard the floorboards creak upstairs again. Only this time I was awake. Morning broke without color. The fog outside had thickened into a wall of pale wool, muting everything it touched, the trees, the earth, the edges of the farmhouse itself. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the condensation slowly creep downward like sweat on glass. The house felt colder today, not by degrees, but by essence. As if something deep inside the walls had turned its face toward me, exhaling frost. I decided to begin exploring room by room, documenting what I found. The logic was simple. If I was going to live here, even temporarily, I needed to understand what this place was, what it had been. I started in the parlor, where last night I'd made my uneasy bed. The furniture was from another century, all turned legs and velvet cushions eaten by moths. A rocking chair sat in the corner, pointed directly at the fireplace as though waiting for someone's return. On the mantel, above a thin line of soot, sat a clock with no hands. Not broken, just blank. A timepiece that didn't bother pretending anymore. In the next room, what must have been the dining area, I found a table still set. For places. Plates rimmed in faded gold, cloth napkins folded under tarnished silverware. A candlestick, half burned, stood in the center beside a small ceramic pitcher filled with what used to be water, now reduced to mineral crust. It didn't feel staged. There was dust on everything, years of it, but nothing had been moved. No signs of interruption or looting, just stillness. A domestic scene locked in suspension, like the inhabitants had stepped outside for air in 1946 and never returned. I moved slowly, trying not to disturb anything. The hallway was narrow, wallpapered in a delicate floral pattern now yellowed with age. Along the wall were photographs in oval frames, men in suspenders, women in modest dresses, all unsmiling. One frame hung slightly crooked, and when I adjusted it, a cloud of plaster dust rained down. The wall behind the frame bore a small black mark, a handprint, child-sized, pressed in charcoal or ash. The master bedroom was worse. Something about it felt wrong the moment I crossed the threshold. Not dangerous, exactly. Just unsettled. The bed was made with military precision, but the sheets had yellowed and split in places. A Bible sat on the nightstand, spine cracked but carefully placed. There was a smell here that hadn't been in the other rooms, an earthy, closed scent, like trapped soil and linseed oil. I opened the closet and found a row of clothes hung neatly on wooden hangers, suits, blouses, a single white dress. Shoes were lined beneath, toes all facing out, as if ready to march away. I checked the drawers next. Most were empty. In the bottom drawer of a tall dresser, I found a small wooden box. It wasn't locked. Inside were 4 objects, a length of twine, brass key, a dried flower, and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded, but the message remained clear. Do not let it hear your name. I stared at the paper for a long time, reading and rereading the line as though it might rearrange itself. The handwriting was elegant, cursive slanted sharply to the right. I placed the items back in the box, except for the key, which I pocketed. The guest room at the end of the hall was small, with 2 twin beds side by side. The room felt newer, somehow, though nothing about it actually was. One bed had a quilt folded at the foot. The other had none. On the windowsill sat a small tin horse, rusted along its edges. I picked it up and turned it in my hands. Beneath it, scratched faintly into the paint of the sill, were 3 initials, TMB, no dates. Just those 3 letters, etched as if in a hurry. I returned downstairs, drawn back to the kitchen. I hadn't touched the pantry since reading the note. Now in daylight, it looked like any ordinary pantry, narrow-shuttered, with an iron latch and a warped bottom edge. But standing in front of it, the air felt different, thicker. I knelt and examined the floorboards near the base of the door. One plank had a strange seam running its length, slightly raised at the corner. I tugged at it. It moved, barely. Beneath it was a hollow space, no deeper than a shoebox. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, dust-covered but intact. I carried it to the table, sat down, and opened to the first page. Written in faded ink, property of Thomas 17th. The handwriting was uneven, childlike in parts, but always legible. The entries were dated but undetailed. Some simply read, "Prepare today," or "Watched at sundown." Others were more cryptic. Mother sang the old song again. I hummed but did not remember the words. Or I cleaned the room. The hooks were rusted. Grandfather said it would not matter. No explanations. No stories. Just fragments, methodical and emotionless. The most repeated phrase, appearing at the end of nearly every entry, was a single line. "It's time." Sometimes it was underlined. Sometimes it stood alone on the page. Always the same words. I flipped through the rest of the journal. Dozens of pages, all signed simply, Thomas. I set the journal down, unease prickling beneath my skin. Who was Thomas? And why 17th? 17th of what? Children? Owners? Sacrifices? I didn't know. But the repetition gnawed at something primal. The kind of dread that doesn't feel like fear, but like recognition. A truth so old you forgot it ever belonged to you. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing more of the overgrown yard beyond the porch. A tangle of brittle grass and rotting fence posts. In the distance, I saw an apple tree. Gnarled, leaning, blackened at the crown. Something white fluttered in its branches. Cloth? Paper. I made a note to investigate later. As I stood to return the journal to its hiding place, I noticed something strange. The table where I had placed it was now slightly damp. Not with water. With condensation. The kind you'd see on glass. The surface was cold to the touch, though no breeze passed through the room. The journal, too, was colder than it should have been, as though it had been stored in ice. I put it back under the floorboard, replaced the plank, and stood. A sound, sudden and low, echoed faintly from upstairs. Not footsteps, not creaks. A drawn-out, tired breath, like the exhale of someone who had been holding it in for years. Frozen in time. That's what the house was. Not abandoned. Not empty. Just waiting. Preserved in its moment of interruption, holding its breath across decades. And now I was the one breathing in its silence. The discovery of the journal marked something. An invisible shift in the house, or maybe just in me. I couldn't say why I went back to the kitchen that night, hours after the sun had sunk behind the trees and the house had swallowed the last of the day's light. But I did. I lit a candle, turned the old chair from the table toward the pantry, and sat down with the book again. This time, I read slower, letting the silence settle around me. The entries were short, clipped, matter-of-fact, but I started to notice a rhythm in them, a pattern. Each entry was made at night. Each entry followed a ritual. The cleaning of the hooks, the counting of steps from the door to the tree outside, the recitation of names. Never full names, just first names. The final line always came as if it were the only one that mattered. It's time. I flipped back to the front. Thomas 17th. What did that mean? 17th generation? 17th child? 17th attempt? My fingers traced the edges of the pages, noticing for the first time that many had fingerprints in the margins. Smudges in the shape of small thumbs and index fingers. The pressure was inconsistent, as if written in haste. One entry, near the middle of the book, broke the pattern. It was longer. Not a paragraph, but still more than the others. He wouldn't come down from the room. Mother said not to force him. Grandfather told me to prepare anyway. The hooks were still red from the last time. I waited. Waited all night. And then, a single addition in red ink, "The house remembers." I stood suddenly, overcome with a feeling that I was being watched. The candle flickered, not from wind, there wasn't any, but from something else. A shift in pressure. I turned toward the back hallway. Nothing, but I swore I'd heard a soft tap, like knuckles against wood. Not the front door. Inside, somewhere near the stairs. I crossed the room slowly, the old floor groaning beneath me. As I passed the pantry, the iron latch shivered, just barely, as if something behind the door had breathed on it. I didn't touch it. I just kept walking. I made my way to the base of the stairs and looked up. Complete darkness, broken only by a shaft of moonlight slicing through the upper landing window. I stood there for a long time, heart crawling in my throat, waiting for a sound that never came. Finally, I turned back and returned to the parlor, setting the journal down with a little more force than necessary. I didn't want to take it back to the couch with me. It felt wrong somehow, like sleeping next to a stranger's confession. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay still, wrapped in the stale warmth of my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling where faint cracks branched like veins. Every creak of the old wood felt too deliberate, too rhythmic. I told myself it was just an old house settling after years of silence, but something in the sound pattern was off. A pause, a repeat, like footsteps circling just beyond my vision. I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, just strange, like pages turning in another room. I sat up, the air cold enough now to see my breath. My flashlight flickered but stayed alive. I moved quietly to the kitchen. The journal was gone. I froze, heart thudding in my ribs like a warning. I hadn't moved it. No one else was in the house. No one else should have been. I followed instinct. The pantry. My hand hesitated at the latch, but I didn't open it. Instead, I knelt again and lifted the loose floorboard. The hollow space was empty. No journal. Nothing at all. A light sweat broke across my back despite the cold. I stood backing away, eyes fixed on the pantry door. There was a low sound just beyond the wood. Not a voice. A scrape, like fingernails trailing down the inside. I left the room without looking back, retreating to the parlor and shutting the double doors behind me. The fireplace loomed, black and dormant. I stood in front of it, unsure what I was even hoping for. Warmth? Answers? Maybe just something ancient and solid. I touched the mantel and felt a rough texture beneath my fingers. Dust? No scratches. I leaned closer and read the words someone had carved into the wood, barely visible in the candlelight. Thomas. There it was again. Not the name, by now the name was everywhere, but the way it was written. Not cursive, not clean. Almost like a warning, carved with shaking hands. Below it, in smaller letters, he speaks through the wood. I turned and scanned the room. The paneling, the floors, even the ceiling beams were all original wood. Handcut. Old-growth pine and oak, darker with age. I walked to the far wall and pressed my hand against the paneling. Oh, my fingers trembled. I pressed my ear to it. Nothing. But then I stepped to the next panel. Still nothing. One more over, near the window, and there it was. A sound deep and low, like the distant echo of someone whispering in another room. I recoiled and stumbled back. The candle guttered in the draft of my movement. I sat heavily on the edge of the couch and stared at the wall, waiting, but no sound came again. Just that silence. That impossible silence that had weight to it. I stayed awake the rest of the night. When the first light of morning filtered through the dusty curtains, I found the journal again. It was back on the kitchen table. Closed, untouched, exactly where I'd first placed it. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. I went outside instead, stepping into the yard where the grass rose to my knees and the fog still clung to the earth like smoke. I made my way to the orchard where I'd seen the apple tree the day before. It was older than I expected, twisted and blackened along the bark, and hanging from one of the lower branches, swaying slightly in the breeze, was a single strip of paper. I pulled it down, written in the same hand as the journal. He remembers you. I crumpled the paper and looked back toward the house. Its windows were dark, reflective, empty, but I no longer believed it was empty. Not at all. The wall didn't look unusual at first. It ran along the hallway between the kitchen and the dining room, narrow, paneled and aging like the rest of the house. But something about it had stayed with me for days. A tightness in the air when I passed by. The faint scent of cedar when I stood too close. And the memory of a sound, hollow and brief, when I dropped my flashlight against it by accident on the second night. A sound that hadn't matched the thickness of the other walls. I told myself it was nothing, that old houses always had quirks, dead spaces between beams, odd acoustics. But the sound had burrowed into me. It itched at the base of my neck like a forgotten word. That morning, I stood before the wall with both palms flat against it. It was cool. Not just from the season, but unnaturally so, like something behind it had never known warmth. I wrapped my knuckles against the surface, moving inch by inch down its length. A hollow response echoed back beneath the third panel from the left. It was faint but unmistakable. A gap. A void where there shouldn't have been one. I pulled a chair from the kitchen and stood on it, running my fingers along the top edge of the molding. Nothing. Then, at the bottom near the baseboard, I noticed a thin seam, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A faint, straight line in the wood that had no reason to be there. I traced it, heart slowing in that peculiar way it does before a revelation. I fetched a knife from the drawer and slipped the blade carefully into the seam. It resisted at first. Then, with a reluctant creak, a section of the panel gave way and swung open an inch on a concealed hinge. Dust poured from the gap in a soft breath. I stepped down from the chair and opened the panel further, revealing a narrow entry, no more than 2 feet wide, cloaked in blackness. The air that rolled out was thick and old, with a sour trace of rot. It was colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that didn't make sense in summer. I shined my flashlight into the space. The beam revealed a short corridor, maybe 10 feet long, ending in a small room. I hesitated. Every nerve in me protested, not from fear exactly, but from the primal knowledge that some doors were never meant to be opened. But I stepped through anyway. The passage was tight, the walls pressing close, lined in unfinished wood. I had to stoop slightly to avoid brushing my head against the rafters. At the end, the space widened into a hidden chamber. The flashlight revealed a small room with stone walls on 3 sides and warped wooden planks on the 4th. The ceiling was low, reinforced with dark beams stained in irregular patterns. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, its back straight, its seat worn smooth. Directly above the chair, affixed to one of the ceiling beams, were 4 rusted iron hooks. They hung like pendulums, lifeless now, but full of suggestion. I stepped closer, trying to convince myself they had once served some benign purpose. But they were too deliberately placed, too symmetrical. Beneath the chair, the floorboards were darkened and sunken slightly in the shape of an old stain. My stomach turned, not just at the sight of it, but at the thought that this had all been built intentionally, planned and hidden with care. To the right of the chair, there was a narrow shelf affixed to the wall. On it sat a stack of small glass jars. Most were empty. A few contained dark, indistinct clumps, something organic, maybe decayed. Next to the jars, carefully arranged, were 3 thin books, each labeled only with a number: 12, 14, and 16. I opened one and found pages of identical handwriting, dated entries, brief notes, ritual instructions. The same handwriting as Thomas's journal. I flipped through each one. They weren't identical, but they followed the same form. Each chronicled what appeared to be a series of preparations, strange observances, and unsettling tasks. Cleaning hooks, polishing a blade, writing and repeating certain names aloud. The name Thomas appeared again and again, never as author, but as subject. Thomas remained silent. Thomas did not resist. Thomas knew. The word began to lose meaning as I read it, becoming something heavier. Less a name, more a title. A role. The implication was clear. There had been others. Before Thomas 17th, there had been a 12th, a 14th, a 16th. And always the same structure. Always the same instructions. I backed away from the shelf, the room suddenly feeling too small. I examined the back wall more closely and found what appeared to be scratch marks, lines and gouges etched into the wood in erratic patterns. Some looked like words, but none I could recognize. At the far left corner, someone had written a phrase in deep, desperate carving. He only comes when it's dark. I swallowed hard. The flashlight flickered. I smacked it gently, and the beam steadied. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The chair was bolted to the floor. Not just placed, anchored. 4 thick screws held it in place. Beneath it, more stains, darker and whiter than the first. Something thick and terrible had seeped into the wood here. I stepped out of the chamber in a daze, closing the panel behind me as gently as I could. The house groaned as it always did, but the sound now felt like disapproval, like resentment. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the parlor, eyes on the staircase, listening for footsteps that never quite arrived. I thought about the hooks, about the jars, about how the handwriting stayed the same, no matter which Thomas had written it. I returned to the wall the next day. The hidden room was unchanged, but I took one of the books with me, number 14. I wanted to study it further, maybe understand what exactly this was. Ritual? Punishment? Belief? I couldn't say. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I had missed the day before. Near the baseboard, half concealed by shadow, was a small etching. The name MB carved into the wood. My initials. It stopped me cold. I hadn't been in that room before. I hadn't touched the wall, the wood, the tools, the shelf. But somehow my name, my mark, was already there. Already waiting. The photograph was tucked beneath the lining of a drawer in the master bedroom, warped slightly from time and hidden beneath a crumbling layer of moth-eaten felt. I hadn't been looking for anything specific, just trying to keep my mind busy after what I'd found behind the hollow wall. But the second I touched the photo, a static chill ran up my arm like a mild electric jolt. It felt colder than paper should. I held it up to the window, letting the afternoon light cut through the grime on the glass and illuminate the faded image. A family stood in front of the farmhouse, arranged stiffly in the yard just beyond the porch. A man and woman, their postures ramrod straight, flanked by 4 children. All dressed in Sunday best, all perfectly still. But something was wrong. All 4 children's faces had been neatly cut out, small oval-shaped holes punched through with surgical precision. Their bodies remained intact, their clothes clear, even their hairstyles preserved. But where their faces should have been, there was only absence. Clean, paper-thin erasure. The mother's face, by contrast, was untouched. In fact, someone had circled it with pencil. Twice. Once carefully, once more aggressively. The graphite lines dug into the emulsion, breaking the surface in jagged arcs. Her expression was subtle but sharp. Lips tight, chin lifted, a tilt to her eyes that made her look half asleep or halfway furious. The father beside her looked hollowed, like a man caught in a single, permanent breath before a scream. There was no date on the back. Just one line, written in faint blue ink, before it started again. I stared at the words for a long time. Before what started again? And who had written it? I brought the photo downstairs and laid it out on the dining room table. I needed to compare it to the family photos lining the hallway. I walked down the corridor and looked again at the oval-framed portraits, each one coated in dust and just a little crooked. None matched the photo exactly, but several bore similar features, the same cheekbones, the same slope of the nose. The family had been here for generations. I was beginning to understand that the house wasn't just shelter, it was a container. A kind of holding cell, maybe for something passed down like a sickness or a name. I examined the faces in the hallway more closely. In 2 of the portraits, the eyes had been scraped. Not defaced exactly, but altered, light scratches across the pupils, enough to make them look blind or empty. On a whim, I removed one of the frames and checked the back. Nothing. But beneath the portrait itself, tucked behind a matting, was a strip of brittle paper. On it, in that same blocky handwriting I'd come to recognize from the journals, she knew the names. She used them anyway. That night, I didn't light the fireplace. I didn't cook. I sat at the table with the photo in front of me, staring at the carved-out spaces where the children's faces should have been. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement at the corner of my vision, small and quick, like someone ducking around the far end of the hallway. But each time I turned my head, nothing was there. At one point, I stood and walked outside. The yard was shrouded in dusk, the apple tree casting long shadows across the grass. I approached it slowly, feeling the soil soften beneath my boots. Up close, the tree was more grotesque than I'd realized. Its trunk was split in several places, like it had burst from the inside. The branches were bare, except for a single scrap of cloth snagged on a higher limb. I recognized it immediately. It was part of a child's dress, old and weathered, faded to the color of bone. I turned away quickly and saw, just past the fence line, A set of 3 stones pressed into the dirt. Not tombstones. Not marked. Just stones, placed intentionally, worn smooth. I walked back into the house with a nausea I couldn't explain. Later, I sat in the parlor, flipping again through Thomas's journal. Toward the back, one entry caught my attention. I cut them out of the picture. Mother said it was better this way. That their faces don't belong to us anymore. I closed the book and pressed my hand to the floor. It was warm. Too warm. As if heat was rising not from a furnace, but from something deeper. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear to the boards. I could hear something faint, a rustling, almost like someone breathing through cloth. I pulled back quickly and stood. That's when I noticed the hallway light had changed. The bulb overhead was dimming, not flickering, just slowly draining of brightness as if something were sucking the voltage out of it. I moved to switch it off, then froze. In the hallway, right beside the crooked portrait with the scratched-out eyes, a shadow stretched against the wallpaper. It wasn't mine. It didn't move when I did. I backed into the parlor and shut the door. I spent the next hour listening to the silence, which had changed. It was no longer neutral. It was tight, pressurized, as though the house itself was holding its breath again. Finally, I gathered my things and retreated upstairs, choosing the smaller guest room this time. I locked the door, knowing it wouldn't matter. I sat on the bed, still dressed, staring out the narrow window into the dark. The stars were gone. Clouds covered everything, and in the absence of moonlight, the trees formed a jagged wall beyond the yard. The apple tree moved in the wind, creaking faintly, but the sound didn't carry like it should have. It was muted, like I was hearing it from inside a dream. I sat there until sleep overtook me, slow and thick and unwilling. In my dream, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the photo on the dining room table. The children's faces were still gone, but now there was a 5th body, taller, leaner, standing just behind the mother where no one had been before. Its face, too, had been cut out, but instead of paper-thin emptiness, I saw only black, a void that pulsed, like it was breathing. When I woke, the bedroom door was ajar, though I knew I'd locked it. On the floor at the foot of the bed was the photograph, and one of the children's faces had returned. A child with my eyes. It took me nearly an hour to summon the nerve to touch the photograph again. When I finally did, it was still warm, as though it had been lying against a body instead of cold floorboards. The child's face, my face, I couldn't deny it anymore, was there, faint but present, slightly misaligned with the body it occupied, like it had been placed there after the fact. The edges of the photo around the face were warped, as though the paper itself had resisted the image. I turned it over again. Still the same writing on the back, before it started again, but now there was something else. A thumbprint in ash or soot, smudged into the lower right corner. I hadn't noticed it the day before. I couldn't imagine how it got there. That was the final push. I had to go back to the hollow wall, back to the room I hadn't been able to stop thinking about. The room with the hooks. The panel creaked open easier this time, like the house had given up pretending to resist me. The passage still smelled of wood rot and something older, something thick and organic. I moved down the narrow corridor with the flashlight in one hand and the photograph folded in my pocket. I didn't know what I expected to find. Another book? More jars? A message left only for me. But when I entered the room, something had changed. At first glance, it looked the same, the chair, the hooks, the stained floorboards, but the light caught on something new. A small object placed deliberately in the center of the seat. I approached slowly. It was a key. Brass, simple, the same size and make as the one I'd found in the box upstairs. But this one was tied with a length of red thread and affixed to a card. The card read, "Pantry." I froze. My breath shortened. I hadn't touched the pantry since reading the note. I hadn't even brushed past it. Something deep inside me had accepted the warning. But now here it was again. That same word. This time presented like an invitation. Or maybe a demand. I took the key, hesitating before sliding it into my coat pocket. The chair remained bolted. The jars still sat in their silent row, their contents undisturbed. But there was one jar second from the right that now bore a label. Thomas 13. The substance inside was blackened, like clotted ink. I didn't open it. I didn't want to know what it smelled like. I returned to the main hall, closing the panel behind me. But I didn't go straight to the pantry. Not yet. I needed distance. I needed light. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the daylight break across my skin, trying to shake the cellar chill still clinging to me. The apple tree was swaying more than it should have been in the breeze. Each movement deliberate, almost performative, like something being stirred from within. I watched it for a while before noticing a new detail. The soil around the base of the tree had been disturbed. Freshly. There were no footprints, no tools, just a churned ring of dirt, loose and dark. I approached slowly, the wind folding the branches against each other in brittle snaps. At the base of the tree, where roots clawed up from the ground, something metallic glinted in the sun. I knelt and uncovered it with shaking fingers. A small medallion, round, bronze, with an inscription around its edge. It read, "For the preservation of sacred order." On the back, etched so finely I had to tilt it to read, Thomas 9. I didn't remember walking back inside. 1 minute I was at the tree. The next, I was standing in the kitchen again, hand resting on the pantry latch. The key felt heavy in my coat pocket, as though it had gained weight since I picked it up. I drew it out, examining the worn brass and the red thread, now frayed at one end. I turned the latch and pressed the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. The click echoed louder than it should have, reverberating through the wooden floor like a dropped hammer. I hesitated, then opened the door. Inside was nothing but darkness at first. No shelves, no canned goods, just black space wider than the room should have allowed. I raised the flashlight. The beam barely penetrated the gloom. But slowly, the shape of the pantry revealed itself. Not a closet at all, but a staircase. Narrow, steep, carved directly into the earth. Dirt walls on either side, wood planks forming a descending spine into the unknown. The air that drifted up was damp, metallic, and tinged with mildew. It smelled like secrets buried too long. I should have turned back. I know that now. But I stepped forward. The stairs groaned beneath me, each one worn to a dip in the center from years of passage. They felt soft, almost spongy, as though saturated with water or something thicker. The walls closed in tighter with each step. My shoulders brushed against dirt and root, cold and unyielding. I kept the light aimed ahead, but the darkness only ever retreated a few feet at a time. After 12 steps, the staircase opened into a small underground room. It was perfectly round, maybe 10 feet across. At the center was a basin, stone, waist-high, carved from a single block. It was filled with liquid. Not water. Something darker. The surface reflected my face in ripples, even though I wasn't moving. Around the basin, symbols had been etched into the floor, now nearly erased by time and moisture. But I could still make out one word repeated 4 times, in a rough circle, Thomas. I didn't hear the door close behind me, but I felt it. A shift in air. A loss of the light I hadn't realized was coming from above. I turned sharply. The staircase was gone, or hidden. The passage behind me now appeared as unbroken wall. I reached forward and pressed my palm to the dirt. Cold, solid. Breath hitched in my throat. Panic climbed, slow but insistent. I turned back to the basin and found the surface of the liquid had changed. It was no longer still. Shapes moved beneath, like fish or fingers or something even less natural. Then the surface calmed, and a name rose to it. Letter by letter, as if written by an invisible hand, M. Barnes. My name. I stumbled back, striking the wall with my shoulder. I shouted. No echo. Just the thick press of soil and silence. I clawed at the wall, searching for seam, a door, a crack. Nothing. Behind me, the basin rippled again, and a second name formed beneath mine. Thomas 18. I stared, frozen, unbreathing. The liquid went still, and something knocked gently, 3 times on the other side of the wall. The knocks were soft and evenly spaced, as though someone on the other side of the wall knew exactly where I stood. I pressed myself flat against the packed earth, every nerve in my body pulled tight. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just listened, mouth open, waiting to hear a voice, footsteps, anything to prove the world still followed familiar rules. But nothing followed. Just the knock. Then silence. Then the faintest whisper of air as if the soil itself had exhaled. The basin sat behind me, perfectly still once more, reflecting nothing now but the overhead darkness. My name had vanished from the surface like a name written in fog. I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to breathe shallowly, listening to the absence of sound. Eventually I turned, placing my back to the wall, and faced the basin again. The stone rim was etched with runes too worn to read, but my fingers could feel them, sharp, purposeful, even after all this time. I leaned forward slowly, against every survival instinct, and peered into the black surface of the liquid. It reflected no light. My own face didn't appear this time. Just a deep void, endlessly dark, as though it wasn't liquid at all, but an aperture. A mouth? Something about the shape of the room, the way the basin was centered and encircled by carvings, told me this wasn't just storage. This was ceremonial. A space of focus. A site for something to be witnessed or called. The longer I stared, the more I felt a pull in the center of my chest. Not physical, not magnetic, but emotional. As if something down there remembered me in ways I couldn't return. I pulled away, heart thudding with nausea and guilt I couldn't place. I began pressing along the walls again, my hands scrabbling at the dirt like a trapped animal. I found no handles, no seams, just cool, unmoving soil. I screamed once, just to test what would happen. Nothing echoed. The sound felt swallowed before it ever left my throat. Panic surged in waves, logical, then wild, then logical again. I knew I hadn't imagined the stairs. I had descended 12 creaking, narrow steps. I had followed a path into the earth. But the house was gone now, erased behind packed wall, as if it had never existed. I slumped against the curve of the chamber and tried to think. I reached for my flashlight. The beam was weak now, sputtering at the edges. I struck it gently, and the bulb flared one last time before flickering out. I was left with a distant red glow from my watch and the oppressive dark that pressed in like cloth against the skin. Then the whispering began. It didn't come from the walls. It came from beneath me. From below the floor, through the stone basin, through the very foundation of the house. It wasn't speech exactly, not words, but a breathless rush of syllables, dry, soft, layered, like dozens of voices murmuring over one another in prayer or warning. I dropped to my knees beside the basin and placed one hand on the stone. The whispering grew clearer. It didn't rise in pitch. It didn't become frantic. It remained measured, relentless, like scripture being recited from memory in a language I didn't know. I heard the name again, Thomas. And then, he waits, over and over. Not angry, not urgent, just true. I staggered back and found myself against the far wall once more. I pulled the photograph from my coat pocket and unfolded it with trembling hands. The image had changed again. The fourth child's face was no longer empty. It had returned. Another version of me, older, thinner, eyes darkened like a shadow had passed directly over them. The mother's circled face looked clearer now, and closer, like she had moved an inch forward in the frame. Her pencil-lined stare seemed to bore directly into mine. And then the wall behind me gave way with a sigh. I fell backward, blinking into sudden brightness. A cold blue-white light illuminated a narrow hallway where dirt had been moments before. I scrambled upright and looked around. The room I'd been trapped in, the chamber with a basin, was gone, just vanished. Behind me, there was only a corridor lined with pale wooden walls and gas lamps flickering without flame. I didn't question it. I ran. The corridor twisted in angles that made no sense. I passed doors with numbers instead of names, 12, 14, 16, and felt a sharp pain in my temples each time I passed one. Like something inside me was being counted. Wait. I came to a staircase that ascended sharply in a spiral. I climbed it without thought, breath hitching, vision tunneling. At the top, a narrow hatch waited. I pushed it open and was hit with blinding sunlight. I stumbled into the orchard behind the house, coughing, clothes streaked with dirt. The sun was high, the wind sharp. For a moment, everything looked normal. But the house had changed. It was still old, still graying and worn, but now the windows on the second floor were open, curtains fluttering like flags of surrender. The front door stood ajar. The air around it pulsed with heat that shouldn't have existed. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, filthy, smeared with something dark that wasn't dirt. And then I heard it again, faint but distinct footsteps beneath the floorboards. Rhythmic, pacing, one end of the house to the other. Back and forth. The sound was wrong, too precise. Not the creaks of an old foundation, but the march of intent. I rushed inside, ignoring every signal to run the opposite direction. The pantry door was wide open now. The stairs inside were gone. In their place was a clean, bare space. Empty shelves, cobwebs, nothing more. As if the basement I had found had never existed at all. But the house was not finished. As I stood there, trying to steady my breath, the whispering resumed. Not under the floor this time. In the walls. In the ceiling. Everywhere. A name repeated over and over. Thomas. 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 Not shouted. Chanted. With reverence. With expectation. And then, just once, it shifted. Matthew. My name. I backed away slowly, heart hammering, and glanced up the staircase. The second floor hallway stretched out in impossible length. At the far end, the last bedroom door stood open. A faint figure stood just beyond it. A boy, pale, still. His face was obscured, but his arms hung limp at his sides. And in one hand, he held my journal. The one I kept beside my bed. The one I hadn't written in for days. He turned and disappeared into the room. And with that simple act, I knew. The house had been waiting. And now it remembered me. I didn't follow the boy right away. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the open bedroom door across the impossibly long second-floor hall, trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes, strained by sleepless nights and creeping shadows, had betrayed me. But I knew what I'd seen. The boy had held my journal. Not one of the others from the hidden room, not one of the ancient, leather-bound relics filled with names and ritual entries, but mine. The one I brought with me. The one I hadn't opened since the night I first saw the word Thomas printed in the corner of the page. And somehow he had it. I began the climb with deliberate steps, each stair creaking louder than I remembered. The air grew heavier with each footfall, thicker and cooler, like it was being pulled from the room above. The second floor hallway stretched wider than it should have, the walls bowing inward like ribs, the faded wallpaper seeming to shift just slightly as I passed. My footsteps echoed even though the carpet was soft and thick with dust. I passed the portraits again, more scratched eyes, more faces blurred or removed. I couldn't stop to look. The hallway seemed to breathe with me, or maybe against me. At the far end, the open door loomed. The boy had disappeared inside, leaving no sound, no trace. I hesitated at the threshold. This had been the guest room, the smaller one, with the twin beds and the tin horse on the sill. But now the room felt different. Not altered in appearance, but in presence. The walls were lined with pages. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all torn from journals, diaries, ledgers, pinned or taped or nailed to the wood in haphazard rows. The handwriting varied, but the content didn't. Each page bore a single name, followed by a date, followed by a phrase, "It is done." Beneath them, an additional line had been scrawled across the floorboards in red chalk. "The house forgets nothing." The boy was gone, but my journal lay neatly on the bed, closed, as though returned with care. I stepped forward and picked it up. The leather felt colder than I remembered. I opened it. The first few pages were unchanged, my own writing, my own words. But about halfway through, the ink shifted. A new hand had taken over. Clean, slanted, unfamiliar. And yet every entry was dated. Not in the past. In the future. July 12th, the hooks have been cleaned. July 13th, preparations complete. July 14th, the offering is ready. I kept turning pages, each line more clinical, less like a journal and more like a report. Until the final page. It read only, "He has accepted." The name is his now. And below it, written faintly in pencil, M. Barnes, Thomas 18. I dropped the journal and stumbled back. The floor groaned beneath me, not for my weight, but as though something beneath had stirred in response. The tin horse on the sill fell to the ground with a metallic clatter. I knelt, shaking, and picked it up. Scratched into its underside were the initials I'd seen before, TMB, but now beside them, another set had been added, recently and crudely, MB. The house was writing me in, inscribing me into its order, into its legacy. I staggered out into the hallway, heart pounding, and descended the stairs 2 at a time. I needed air. I needed sky. I burst out the front door and into the yard, collapsing near the porch steps. The sky above was thick with gray, clouds boiling slow and low across the treetops. The apple tree groaned in the distance, its limbs moving against no wind I could feel. I clutched the tin horse in my palm, pressing its edges into my skin just to feel something real. Then I noticed something else. The mailbox at the end of the gravel drive. Its flag was up. I hadn't touched it. No one had, but it stood at a rigid angle, red and defiant against the dull landscape. I rose, legs unsteady, and walked slowly down the path. Each step felt labored, like I was moving through something thicker than air. I reached the box and opened it. Inside was a letter. No envelope. Just a single folded page, pale and thin, like the kind used for sermons or funeral announcements. I opened it. The message was brief. You are not the first to forget your name, but you will be the last to give it back. It wasn't signed. I turned and looked back at the house. Its windows watched me, black and depthless. The porch sagged more than it had before. The wood looked bloated, sick, like it had fed on something it shouldn't have. I returned slowly, glancing toward the orchard. There were more stones now. Not just the 3 I'd seen before. 5, 6, 7, arranged in uneven rows. Some freshly disturbed. Back inside, the whispering had returned, subtle beneath the floorboards. I pressed my ear to the wall near the kitchen and listened. A voice, singular this time. It whispered slowly and clearly, "It's time." I ran my hands along the wall, half expecting it to open again, to reveal another room, another passage, another chamber of silence. But nothing moved. Only the voice repeated again and again, steady as breath, "It's time." I backed away, retreating to the parlor, where the fireplace remained cold and the mantel bore the carved name I had nearly forgotten, Thomas. I sat on the couch, the journal beside me, and stared at the empty hearth. There was a knock on the door. Not frantic, not polite, just a knock, measured 3 times. I froze. The knock came again. I stood slowly, approaching the door, and reached for the knob. My hand paused. My reflection in the glass pane of the door didn't match me. It moved slower, delayed. My head tilted left. The reflection tilted right. And for a moment, I wasn't looking at me. I was looking at someone else, someone dressed like me, with my hair, my posture, but the eyes were wrong. Older, hungrier. The knock came a 3rd time. I didn't open the door. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, back to the bedroom, back to the journal. I flipped to the final page again. Thomas 18. The words hadn't changed, but below them now, freshly inked and still damp, was a new sentence. "He has heard you." And beneath that, one word, spaced apart, alone. Come. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while the whispers moved through the floorboards like slow current beneath ice. The word was still there on the final page. Come, fresh as if written in breath, ink still slightly glistening under the lamplight. I wanted to believe it was a prank, a breakdown, a trick of solitude in a house with too many dead memories. But deep down I knew better. The house had never been empty. It had just been patient. At some point before dawn, the whispering stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like a switch had been thrown. The stillness that followed was worse than the voices. It was a silence so complete it felt like the house had stopped breathing. I sat up slowly, every joint aching. My skin itched with cold sweat. There was a strange pressure in the air, as if something was waiting for me to move. I picked up the journal again, half hoping the words would have changed, half fearing they wouldn't. They hadn't. Come. That was all. I carried the book downstairs, stepping lightly even though I knew there was no one to wake. The parlor was exactly as I'd left it, though the air had taken on a different weight, thicker, expectant. The firewood I'd stacked near the hearth on my first day still sat untouched. I hadn't lit a single fire since arriving. I realized I was afraid to give the house something warm to feed on. I sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, journal in my lap, and stare at the carved name on the mantel. Thomas. Underneath it, I ran my fingers across the smaller etching. "He speaks through the wood." That was all it had said. I pressed my hand flat against the old timber. It was cool, but not dead. There was something beneath it. Not sound, not movement, just presence. As if the wall and the wood and the very frame of the house were watching me back. I decided I had to understand what Thomas really meant. Not just a name, not just a person. A role, a repetition. I returned to the hollow wall, opened the concealed panel, and entered the narrow corridor again. There was damper than before. The floor creaked in ways it hadn't. When I stepped into the hidden room, I froze. Everything was gone. The chair, the hooks, the jars, the books, the shelf. Even the stain on the floor had faded. The space was bare and unremarkable. Just walls, old boards, dust. Like it had all been removed in a single breath, wiped clean of history. But the smell remained. That scent of old iron and stone and something deeper, ritual, maybe, or grief. In the corner, I saw something. A new object. A folded cloth bundle, resting where the chair used to be. I knelt and opened it. Inside were pages, thin, yellowed, brittle. Not journal entries. Letters. Some handwritten, others typed, all dated. I sorted through them carefully. The names were unfamiliar at first, but then I began to see a pattern. A letter from a woman named Eliza Maddox, dated 1914, referencing the preparations for Thomas. Another from 1882, by a man named James Durham, warning of the cost of delaying the 13th. Names, places, dates. Different families. Different centuries. But always the same word, Thomas. There was one letter without a date. It was written in blue ink on paper that looked newer than the rest. It wasn't signed, but it read like it was meant for me. You think you're outside it. You're not. None of us were. It isn't blood that ties us to the house. It's agreement. An inheritance of silence. A contract made in names. Beneath the letter was a photograph. Black and white, slightly bent. A child seated on the chair that used to be in the room. Face blurry, eyes looking down. In the background, I could see the hooks. I turned the photo over. One line, Thomas 7. Failed. I stood, suddenly breathless, clutching the pages. My head was spinning. None of this was new. None of it spontaneous. This wasn't a haunting, it was a system. An inherited responsibility, passed from name to name, enacted like a ritual play. I wasn't just a visitor. I was next in line. Not because I wanted to be, but because someone had decided I was. I left the hidden room and returned to the hallway. On a whim, I opened the hallway closet I'd avoided before. Inside, beneath a pile of moth-eaten coats, was a crate filled with journals. Dozens, each labeled with a number. Not in sequence. Scattered. 5, 11, 13, 15, 17. Some were falling apart, others almost pristine. I opened one at random and read the first page. I was told I had a choice. But by the time they say your name, it's already too late. It's already inside you. The handwriting was neat. Female. The rest of the entries dissolved into erratic scrawls, drawings, repetitions of the same sentence. I didn't forget. I didn't forget. I didn't forget. Over and over until the ink bled through the paper. I dropped the book and sat on the floor, head in my hands. The truth was unavoidable now. Thomas wasn't a person. It was a position. A vessel. A stand-in for something the house needed. And every time a new Thomas was chosen, the process repeated. The house called. The name was given. The ritual enacted. A sacrifice made. I don't remember how long I sat there. Hours maybe. When I finally stood, the light outside had shifted again. Evening was closing in. Shadows stretched across the floor like fingers. I picked up my own journal and began to write. Not to confess. Not even to remember. Just to hold on to something that still felt like mine. But when I opened it, the pages were no longer blank. Every page had already been filled. Not in my handwriting, but in a hand I knew. The same slanted script from the others. The first entry read, July 15th, the voice beneath the boards has spoken. He does not resist. The next read, July 16th, the vessel accepts the name, and beneath that, he listens now. I closed the book slowly, my breath caught in my throat, because somewhere beneath the floorboards, the whispering had returned, and this time it was using my voice. The whispering mimicked me, not just my voice, but my cadence, my pauses, the faint tremor I tried to hide when I spoke aloud to myself. It echoed beneath the floorboards in perfect rhythm, reciting the words I had written in my own journal, like the house had been reading over my shoulder for days. I tried speaking a word, anything to break the loop, and heard it repeated seconds later, slightly distorted but unmistakably mine. "Hello," I said softly. "Hello," it answered, buried beneath wood and dirt. It didn't feel like mockery. It felt like rehearsal, as if the house was practicing how to be me. I stepped back from the parlor, avoiding the boards that creaked loudest, and moved into the dining room. The table still held the photograph I'd folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to split. I looked at it again. All the faces were back now, not just the children. The whole family. Their eyes were darkened, their mouths slightly open, as if caught mid-sentence. Only one face remained missing, mine. The oval space where it had once been returned to absence. Placeholder. Waiting to be filled again. I felt watched, not just by the house, but by the very architecture. The lines of the doorways, the corners of the ceilings, the slope of the staircase, it all pointed inward, toward the center. Toward me. The air had grown impossibly still. Even the wind outside had gone quiet. The trees no longer rustled. No branches tapped the windows. Nothing stirred. And then the voice came again, not from beneath, but from behind. "It's time." I turned, but there was no one there. Just the hallway, narrowing like a throat, stretching toward the front door that never opened. The light in the ceiling flickered once, then held. "It's time," the voice said again, this time closer, as though standing just behind my shoulder. I didn't answer. I walked to the door and opened it. Nothing waited outside. The yard looked the same, except for the apple tree. Its trunk had split further. The bark now peeled in long, curling strips. The earth around its base pulsed faintly, as if breathing. I stepped onto the porch and saw, just to the left of the steps, another new object, a suitcase. My suitcase. The one I'd brought with me the first day, long since forgotten in the entryway. It had been placed neatly on the porch, upright, as though someone had packed it for me. I approached it with caution. Inside were all my things, folded and arranged. My clothes, my notebooks, my toothbrush. But on top, where I hadn't placed it, was one of the Thomas journals, number 18, freshly labeled. I picked it up. The first page was blank. The second too. But the third bore a single line in black ink. "You have a choice." But not for long. The wind returned as I stood there, sudden and sharp. It swept across the field and through the porch like a whisper with teeth. I looked back toward the tree and saw something hanging from one of its higher branches. A strip of cloth. White. Frayed. It fluttered once, then stilled. I remembered the first time I'd seen it, hanging there like a forgotten flag. But now there were more. 6 strips. Maybe 7. Some thin as ribbon, others thicker like torn sleeves. They all hung in silence. I walked back inside and locked the door, though I knew it made no difference. The lock clicked with a tired finality. In the hallway, the portraits had changed. Where before there had been oval frames with unsmiling ancestors, now there were mirrors. 8 of them, evenly spaced, all in the same tarnished brass. My reflection stared back from each one, but not identically. In one, my eyes were darker. In another, I smiled without smiling. In the fourth, I wore clothes I didn't recognize. I walked the length of the hallway, glancing at each one. Only the last was empty. The glass held nothing, just black. A mirror that didn't reflect. I reached out to touch it. My fingers met glass that was cold, wet, as if condensation had formed on the inside. And then, in the reflection, I saw movement. Not mine. Someone behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the hallway was empty. In the parlor, the fireplace roared to life without flame or spark. The mantel glowed, the name Thomas etched into it brightening like a brand. I stepped closer and saw that the carving had deepened. Beneath it, 2 new words had appeared. He answers. I backed away, lightheaded. The whispering returned in a wave, surrounding me now from all sides. And then for the first time, it spoke not to me, but as me. I am Thomas. I dropped the journal. It landed open, spine cracked, on the page where the name had been written a dozen times. Each instance now ended with a number 18. I knelt, flipping forward. The pages had filled themselves. The ink looked wet. Entries appeared as I turned. He accepts the name. He walks where the others could not. He forgets the other name. The last page read, he watches the watchers. The floor creaked behind me. I turned. There was a man in the doorway. He looked like me. Not exactly. Not in any literal way. But he felt like me, familiar in the shape of his shoulders, in the tilt of his head, in the calm detachment in his expression. His mouth was closed. His eyes were wide. He raised his hand slowly and pointed toward the fireplace. I turned back. On the mantel, something sat now that hadn't been there before. Box. Small, wooden, sealed with a rusted latch. I stepped forward and lifted it with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, was a key, longer than the others. Ornate. Not brass, but black iron, carved with vines and symbols I didn't recognize. A tag dangled from its loop. It read, Final Room. When I looked back, the man was gone. Only the journal remained on the floor, its pages fluttering though no wind moved in the house. And the house whispered again. But this time, it spoke only one word. Enter. The key felt wrong in my hand. Too cold, too textured, the iron biting into my palm with grooves like teeth. I didn't recognize the symbols carved into its shaft, twisting vines and angular shapes that shimmered faintly in the light, but only when I didn't look at them directly. I turned the box over in my lap, searching for any other clue, but it was bare. Old wood, blackened at the corners, the smell of mildew baked in. The tag that read Final Room fluttered slightly, though the air in the parlor had grown still again. I didn't want to move. I wanted to stay in that room, locked in the soft creaking of the house's breath, suspended in uncertainty. But I already knew where the key was meant to go. It had been there since the beginning, and I had simply ignored it, as we often do with things that hum too loudly in the corner of our minds. Upstairs, in the master bedroom, across from the dresser and beneath the window that refused to open, there was a door I had never opened. I had seen it, of course I had, but I'd always dismissed it as a closet or a sealed crawl space. It bore no knob, only a keyhole, recessed and rimmed in rust. No one locks a closet. That had been my logic. But I was no longer working in the realm of logic. I climbed the stairs slowly, the journal under one arm, the key clenched in my hand. The mirrors in the hallway remained. 7 versions of myself watched me pass, their gazes following, their mouths twitching with something close to recognition. One of them smiled. Only one, and not with kindness. I reached the bedroom and stood before the door. It was narrower than I remembered. The wood was darker too, as if something behind it had been staining it from within. I knelt to examine the lock. It was old, but the metal around the keyhole looked polished. Just often. I slipped the key in and turned. The mechanism resisted, then gave with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. The door creaked open, exhaling a breath of air that smelled of stone and still water. Inside was a staircase descending. Not a closet. Not a room. A stairwell, narrow and steep, walled with smooth, dark stone. I stepped through the threshold, and the air shifted behind me. The door swung shut with an audible latch, sealing itself. I didn't bother turning back. I knew what I'd find, solid wall, no handle, no hinges. I'd passed through one-way thresholds before. I descended, counting each step aloud. 1, 2, 3. The whispering began again around 8. Faint, murmured voices that grew clearer not with volume, but with presence, like they were gaining shape as I got closer. 12, 13, 14. The walls began to change. What was once smooth stone became something else, something porous, veined, like the interior of a living organism. Moisture glistened in the cracks. I could hear the dripping of water, but none appeared. The steps grew wider. 21, 22. I stopped counting. The stairway opened into a chamber. larger than I expected. Cathedral-height ceilings, arched with beams too symmetrical to be natural. In the center of the room stood a table. Around it, 7 chairs. 6 were occupied. They didn't move as I entered. They didn't look up. Their faces were all veiled by thin gray cloth, sheer enough to show outlines, cheekbones, brows, hollow mouths. They were dressed in formal clothing from different eras. One wore a black frock coat and high collar. Another, a pale dress that brushed the floor. Another still in a faded wool uniform, buttons green with age. Each of them clutched something in their lap, a book, a locket, a bone. The 7th chair was empty. I approached slowly, the journal still clutched under my arm, the iron key now growing heavier in my hand. The figures did not speak, but the whispering in the room rose, first a trickle, then a tide, until it filled every corner of the chamber. Not words. Not exactly. Names. Over and over. Thomas, Eliza, Barnes, Maddox, Durham. Each name spoken like a breath, overlapping until they merged into a single voice. I reached the empty chair and stood behind it. The table was carved with markings I recognized, the same ones from the key. A circle of names, and at the center a single phrase etched in deep slashes. The house is the mouth. The whispering stopped. Total silence. And then one of them moved. The figure in the high-collared coat raised its hand and pointed at me. Slowly, deliberately. Another followed. Then another. Until all 6 pointed, not at me, but at the chair. I sat. The air shifted again. Heavier now. Saturated with expectation. One of the figures leaned forward, and for the first time a voice emerged. Not a whisper, not an echo, but a sound like stone scraping wood. Name. I opened my mouth. Nothing came. The journal in my lap opened of its own accord. Pages fluttered until they reached the last, still blank. The voice repeated, Name. I knew then that it was a choice, but not the kind I'd hoped for. It was the kind that binds you either way. Refuse and be erased. Accept and become part of the machine. I lowered my gaze and whispered, Thomas. The table glowed. Not bright, not blinding. A dim warmth rose from the carvings, and the names etched into the stone began to shift, rearranging themselves. Mine appeared at the bottom of the circle. M. Barnes, Thomas 18. The veiled figures bowed their heads in unison. Then the walls opened. Not like doors, like lungs. The chamber breathed outward, revealing corridors I hadn't seen. Dark hallways filled with portraits, mirrors, staircases spiraling into nothing. I stood, numb, and followed the path that pulled at me most strongly. I didn't think about escape. That word no longer applied. At the end of the corridor, I found a small room, lit by a single bulb. In the center, a desk. On it, a typewriter. Clean. Waiting. Next to it, a folder marked Witness Account 18. A chair waited behind it. The same make as the one from the room with the hooks. The same one from the journal. I sat. The first page slid into the machine by unseen hands, and I began to type. The keys of the typewriter clicked beneath my fingers, mechanical and final, each stroke echoing too loudly in the tiny room. I didn't think about the words. They came without effort, as though they'd already been written inside me and were only now revealing themselves, letter by letter. I typed my name first, Matthew Barnes, and then the title I never asked for, Thomas 18. The page drank the ink hungrily, each letter darker than it should have been, as if the machine was bleeding truth rather than printing it. The folder to my right bore the mark Witness Account 18 and sat slightly open, revealing blank sheets waiting to be filled. I knew instinctively that I would not leave this room until they were. I had been brought here to remember and to record. But even that wasn't quite right. It wasn't about me remembering. It was about the house remembering through me. The room had no windows, no clock, no door visible behind me anymore. Just the desk, the typewriter, the folder, and the faint buzz of the single bulb overhead. The air was still and smelled faintly of wax and damp stone. It was not suffocating, but it was stale in a way that made my skin itch. I looked up, half expecting the veiled figures to return, but I was alone. Somehow I knew they were still near, watching, not for me to fail, but for me to continue. I began the account where it wanted me to begin, Not with my arrival at the house, not even with the signing of the deed. I started with the first moment the name Thomas appeared. The corner of the journal. That faint print. I typed it like a confession, like a spell. I saw the name Thomas in the bottom corner of my journal, and I did not question it. The keys clicked on. I ignored what should have been impossible. I wrote on the same page. I allowed it to continue. There was no judgment in the words, no apology either. Just fact. The typewriter accepted each line like scripture. Time slipped as I wrote. I could no longer tell if I was there for hours or days. I wrote of the photographs, faces cut and returned, the circle around a mother's eyes, the child's face that had shifted to resemble mine. I wrote of the whispers, the hooks, the black pool beneath the house that had spoken my name. I wrote of the mirrors, the orchard, the boy who held my journal and moved without sound. The house had revealed itself in fragments, and now, through me, it was piecing those fragments together. At some point, I paused and rubbed my hands. The skin around my knuckles had reddened, cracked. My nails were dark, though I hadn't been outside in what felt like days. I turned back to the typewriter and continued. I wrote about the 6 figures in the chamber, their veiled faces, the moment I claimed the name. I wrote about the key, the one labeled Final Room, and how its weight had changed as soon as I accepted it. And when I reached the moment where the room had opened around me, breathing like a lung, I felt the bulb above flicker slightly, like it approved. There was no food, no water, no fatigue, just the typewriter in my hands and the story that wasn't mine but needed my voice. And then, after what might have been the 100th page, the typewriter stopped. I tried pressing the next key. It didn't move. I reached for the folder. Full. Every page filled, neatly stacked, ink dry and precise. On the top page, my name again, underlined once. Matthew Barnes, Thomas 18. I stood slowly. The chair had molded to my shape. I hadn't noticed how deeply. I reached for the door, except there wasn't one. Only the same wall that had always been there. No knob, no frame. I turned slowly, scanning the room again. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The bulb above me began to dim, slowly. The folder on the desk snapped shut with a soft clap. I reached toward it, and it slid away from my hand, pulled by something unseen into a thin slit in the desk that hadn't existed seconds ago. The papers disappeared within it like a tongue receiving communion. Then, finally, a noise. Click behind me. I turned. A seam had appeared in the wall. A door-shaped outline. I pressed against it, and it gave way. Beyond it was not the staircase I expected. Not a passage back to the parlor or the orchard or the bedroom where the windows never opened. It was a tunnel, circular and wet, the walls made of stone and root, pulsing faintly with red light. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a gentle sound, like the end of a breath. The air in the tunnel was warm, metallic, like old blood. I followed the path, unsure whether I was descending or ascending. Time unraveled again. I walked until I no longer knew what it meant to stop, until I reached a chamber that had no center and no edges, just space, and within it a figure, pale, motionless. It sat in a chair identical to mine, hands folded, head lowered. A journal lay at its feet, open to a blank page. I approached. Its face was mine, but older, not aged by time, but by weight. Its eyes opened as I drew near. They were mine, but emptied out, like the echo of a scream long past. The figure looked up and whispered one word. Finally, I wanted to ask what it meant, but I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The figure stood slowly, and I stepped aside as it passed me, vanishing into the corridor I had come from. I looked down at the chair. It was still warm. A whisper rose behind me. The room changed again. No, it was a library. Infinite. Walls of shelves, packed with journals. Each spine bore a number. And a name. Maddox. Durham. Falling. Barnes. I found my place. My journal. Neatly shelved between 17 and 19. I placed my hand on the spine. It opened for me. And on the first page, new ink appeared, slowly forming a single line. He sits now. And I did. I sat because there was nothing else left to do. The chair welcomed me, not with comfort, but with the recognition of familiarity, like a pair of shoes that remembered my feet. The journal in my lap lay open, the ink on the first line still glistening faintly. He sits now. Beneath it, the page remained blank, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was listening, waiting. The air in the library was motionless, not heavy or light, simply present. Not a place to breathe, but to be absorbed. The walls rose impossibly high, stacked with spines in shades of brown, red, and black, some cracked with age, others pristine and new. The silence wasn't oppressive, but it had weight, as if every book surrounding me whispered with all the voices that had written them. I reached for the pen that had appeared beside the journal. Its nib was old, dipped in ink that shimmered dark blue. I didn't know where to begin, but the moment I placed it to the page, my hand moved on its own. Not possessed, not forced, just compelled by something deeper than memory. July 17th, I wrote. I have entered the stacks. I am seated. I am seen. The words felt like ritual, like they had been written 100 times by 100 others before me. Still, I continued. The one who came before me is gone. The one after waits. That sentence stopped me. The one after. Had I already seen them? Or would I? The thought made me shiver, though the air in the library was neither warm nor cold. I looked down the corridor, to my right. There were no visible doors, but the shelves bent and curved, disappearing into spirals that defied geometry. Somewhere, deeper in the labyrinth, I sensed movement. Not loud, not threatening, just constant, like someone walking in circles. I turned back to the journal and wrote again. I hear the footsteps. They are not mine, but they sound like me. I paused and read the line twice, then underlined it without thinking. Then the whispering returned. It started behind me, low and intimate, like breath directly against the back of my neck. I turned quickly, but no one stood there. Just a gap between shelves and a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. The whisper said my name once, then again, slower, more drawn out. Matthew. The voice wasn't my own this time. It was higher, familiar. I stood and followed the sound without writing another word. The path narrowed until the shelves pressed close enough to brush my shoulders. The spines of the books grew older as I passed. Thicker bindings, hand-sewn pages, wax seals untouched for decades. Some bore no names, only symbols. A hooked cross, a twisted tree, an eye without a pupil. I turned another corner and stopped. Before me was a mirror. Unlike the hallway mirrors in the house, this one was oval, set into a wooden frame carved with roots and veins. Its surface rippled slightly, like water touched by wind. My reflection was not my own. It was me, but gaunt, paler, eyes ringed with something darker than fatigue. He stared at me with a calm that made my stomach churn. Then he smiled. Just once. I stepped closer and saw, written across the glass in reverse script, a message. You've already come back. I reached out and touched the mirror. It was warm. A hum ran through the glass and up my fingers, into my palm, into the bones of my wrist. I staggered back. The reflection disappeared. Only my true face remained now, shocked, afraid, uncertain. I turned and continued walking. The whispering had stopped, but now there was music. Distant, low. A piano playing a song I didn't recognize, slow and deliberate. I followed the sound through the endless aisles until I arrived at a wide clearing in the center of the stacks. There was a piano, upright, old but polished, keys exposed like teeth. A woman sat before it, her back to me, playing. Her hair was gray, bound in a long braid. Her dress was older than any fashion I knew. She didn't turn as I approached, but her voice floated out soft and steady. You took your time. I said nothing. Sit, she said, gesturing toward the bench beside her without breaking rhythm. I obeyed. She played a final chord, let it hang, then lifted her hands. Do you know the song? She asked. I shook my head. Good, she said. That means you're still becoming. I studied her profile. Her skin was weathered, her features sharp. She didn't look at me, not directly, but something about her presence filled the room. The air shifted around her like a current. I was the sixth, she said. Eliza. Thomas Six. The name struck me like a stone dropped into water. Maddox, I whispered. She nodded. They always remember the surname, never the role. She placed her hands in her lap. You're doing well, Matthew. You've accepted quickly. Most fight longer. I didn't accept, I said. Not really. She smiled, I still forward. Doesn't matter. The house accepts on your behalf. We sat in silence. I wanted to ask her everything. What was happening? Why me? What came next? But the words tangled in my throat. She stood suddenly and walked behind the piano, revealing a small box on the stool. She picked it up and held it out to me. I took it cautiously. Inside was a small piece of paper folded thrice. I opened it. A single sentence, "There will be another storm." I looked up, confused. What does this mean? Eliza shrugged. The house remembers in patterns. Storms always mark a change. You'll see. She stepped back, already fading from the edges of the room. You'll know when it's time to return to the room beneath the roots. I stood, but she was gone. The piano sat in silence. I made my way back through the shelves, following instinct more than path, until the spiral ended again at the journal's desk. I sat and flipped open the book. The page where I had stopped writing was no longer blank. A new line had appeared in ink I hadn't laid. Eliza played the song. The key has been tuned. I turned to the next page. At the top, it read, "Storm record begins." And just then, I heard it. Distant thunder. A low growl rolling through the walls of the library. Somewhere above me, the house was waking again. The thunder rolled again, closer now, with a distinct heaviness of something not entirely weather. It didn't echo like a natural storm would. Instead, it pressed inward, like the sound was born within the walls themselves and needed no sky to announce its presence. I sat at the desk, the journal open before me, the ink still glistening where it read, "Storm record begins." My hand hovered over the page, but the words wouldn't come. The house was shifting again, not violently, but deliberately, as if it were making room. The walls of the library groaned, and I heard the shelves begin to rearrange. Not all at once, but methodically, books sliding, hinges creaking, wooden planks nudging forward and back. The path I had taken to Eliza's piano was gone now. In its place stood a narrow hallway lit by dim, flickering gas lamps. The scent of ozone drifted in from nowhere, the sharp smell of metal and impending rain. I stood, slipping the journal into the inner pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed something beneath the fabric, a thin strip of paper I hadn't remembered placing there. I pulled it out carefully. It was the note from Eliza. "There will be another storm." I stared at it until the lights in the hallway dimmed again, urging me forward. I followed. The hallway wound tight, its turns sharp and unnatural. The walls here were no longer shelves, but panels of stone and dark timber. Occasionally, I passed narrow slits in the wall, too thin to be windows, too high to be doors. They gave off a faint glow, like candlelight filtered through bone. As I passed them, I began to hear it again, the whispering. Not loud, not insistent, just a presence, a reminder. At one of the turns, I found a door. It hadn't been there a second before. Its surface was covered in soot, charred in places, the handle blackened and cool. I paused. The thunder cracked again, this time overhead. I placed my hand on the handle and turned. Inside was a room I recognized. It was the dining room from the farmhouse. The same table. The same crooked chairs. But different now. The walls were scorched. The wallpaper had peeled into black curls. The floorboards were warped from water or heat. The photograph still sat on the table, though it too had changed again. All the faces had returned, even mine. But now every pair of eyes was looking in the same direction, past the photographer, towards something just out of frame. Their expressions were tight, anticipating. I stepped into the room fully and felt the door behind me vanish. The storm had arrived here first. Wind swirled faintly around the baseboards, bringing with it the scent of moss and fire. I approached the table and touched the photo. Something thudded above me. I looked up. The ceiling pulsed once. Then a sound heavy and dragging moved across it from one side to the other. Footsteps, slow, calculated, then silence. I backed away toward the parlor door. It creaked open on its own, revealing the hallway I'd walked a dozen times before. The mirrors were gone now. In their place were long panels of black fabric, pinned to the top, hanging loose like funeral banners. As I passed each one, the cloth stirred, though no wind reached this corridor. At the far end, the staircase down to the basement had changed. No longer rotting, no longer half sunken in shadow, it had been rebuilt. Fresh wood, clean railings. The steps were sanded smooth. The air pouring up from below was warm and sweet, like incense. The house wanted me to go down. I descended. With each step, a new whisper joined the chorus. Not incoherent, not maddened. Familiar. Names, events, fragments of my own memories layered between others I didn't recognize. A dog barking at dusk. A hymn hummed under breath. A key buried in dry soil. They pressed against me like fog. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the basement transformed. It was no longer a single room, but a corridor lined with alcoves. In each alcove stood a pedestal, and on each pedestal was a relic. I approached the first. A child's shoe. Scuffed. Burned on one side. Next, a doll's head, split down the middle. Next, a rusted tin plate, cracked in half. Every object held weight, not just in appearance but in atmosphere. I could feel their histories pressing against me. These were offerings. Not decorative. Not sentimental. They had been left here for a reason, and the house had remembered every single one. In the final alcove, there was nothing. Just an empty pedestal, clean and waiting. Beneath it, scratched into the wood floor, was my name. No number. Just Matthew, not Thomas. Not yet. I stared at it until the thunder rolled again, closer this time. Dust fell from the rafters. The house moaned. Something was coming. I turned and found the corridor had narrowed behind me. It led to a single door, painted red. A single word was etched into the surface, confession. I pushed it open. Inside was a room built entirely of mirrors. Walls, floor, ceiling. Every surface reflected endlessly. I stepped in, and there were thousands of me. Each version slightly different. Some older, some bruised. One with bleeding eyes. Another wearing the veil I'd seen on the seated figures. I moved toward the center and found a single chair. I sat. The whispering ceased. One reflection moved differently. He leaned in close and spoke, not aloud, but inside me. His mouth never opened. But I heard him clearly. You must tell the house what it already knows. I didn't respond. He repeated, you must confess. The chair locked beneath me. Cold bands of metal wrapped around my wrists and ankles. Not tight enough to hurt, just enough to hold. The room pulsed with light. And then, one by one, the mirrors began to show not reflections, but memories. My childhood home. My mother's voice. The time I lied about the broken window. The time I wished someone dead and felt nothing when they passed. The time I left someone behind and told myself it was mercy. Each mirror showed a truth. Some I had buried. Some I didn't recognize. Each one sharpened like a blade, stripping the comfort from my name. I began to speak. Quietly, then louder. I told the mirrors what they already knew. I confessed, and the house listened. The confession bled out of me in fragments, like sap from a wounded tree. I didn't try to organize my thoughts. I simply spoke. The room of mirrors reflected not just my image, but every word back at me, as if documenting the truth for an audience I couldn't see. The reflections leaned forward as I did, their mouths moving with mine, echoing every syllable with a silent reverence that felt more ritual than response. I admitted to things long forgotten, lies I told to protect myself, silences I let fester until they became weapons. The guilt I'd carried like loose change, rattling in my pockets with every quiet betrayal. It all came out slow and raw, until the air itself felt charged with confession. And then the room shifted. The mirrors pulsed once, light flickering across their surfaces like heat lightning over glass. My voice died on my lips. The restraints holding my limbs released with a soft hiss, and the chair reclined slightly, as though inviting rest. But I didn't move. Not yet. The final mirror in front of me, the one I had avoided looking into directly, shimmered and went dark. Slowly, an image surfaced on its face, but it wasn't a reflection. It was a room. The dining room. My great-uncle's house precisely as I had first found it. The table untouched since 1946, dust thick in the corners, the air pale and still. A slow panning view moved through the room without sound. No figures. No movement. But in the center of the table was the photograph, this time fully intact. Every face visible. Every face watching the lens. At the far end of the table, a figure sat. I recognized him instantly. It was me. Older. Motionless. Head tilted slightly as though listening to something just beyond hearing. My throat tightened as the image zoomed slowly toward the face, and I saw what had changed. The eyes were wrong. Not empty, not lifeless, replaced. Eyes that had seen too many versions of the same truth. Eyes that had sat in this chair too long. I reached for the mirror, but my fingers met cold glass. The image didn't react. The figure at the table didn't blink. Then the mirror whispered, "Return." The word etched itself into the surface like breath on cold glass, then slowly disappeared. The room began to dissolve. The mirrors shattered one by one, not violently, but like crystal under pressure. Their fragments fell upward, dissolving into the dark above. The floor dropped out from under me. I fell without impact. I landed standing, back in the parlor. The journal was on the table. The fireplace burned with a pale blue flame, casting no heat. Outside the windows, the sky had shifted. Not night, not day. A perpetual dusk, stretched and stained, the clouds overhead unmoving. I opened the journal, knowing what I would find. New entries, all written in my hand, except I had not written them. July 18th, the confession has been received. July 18th, the storm draws near. July 18th, the roots have begun to stir. I flipped forward and found an entry dated for tomorrow. July 19th, the orchard will open. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew where I had to go. The wind outside had picked up, though the trees stood perfectly still. I stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under my feet. The apple tree was no longer twisted and bare. It had bloomed, overnight, impossibly. White blossoms coated its limbs, and beneath them, the soil had been turned. Fresh furrows, as if something or someone had been planted there. I crossed the yard slowly, the grass crunching dry beneath my boots, even though the sky hinted at rain. When I reached the base of the tree, I stopped. A door had emerged from the trunk. Not built, not added, but grown. Its surface was bark, shaped into the clear outline of a frame, with a small iron handle embedded in the wood. No seams, no hinges, just an invitation. I touched the handle, warm. A heartbeat pulsed behind the wood. I opened it. Inside, a tunnel descended, lit by phosphorescent moss clinging to the roots. The walls curved like the inside of a throat, and the air smelled of rot and spring in equal measure. I stepped through. The door sealed behind me with a muffled thump, and the path pulled me forward. This was the root room Eliza had spoken of, and now it had accepted me. The descent was long and winding, the walls narrowing and widening at will. Shapes moved just beyond a light, things I couldn't name, couldn't face. Whispered songs followed me. Voices I didn't recognize sang in tones just above thought. When the tunnel opened, I stood in another chamber, this one circular, with a pool in the center. But it was not water. It was light. White and still, its surface shimmered with images I couldn't quite grasp. Faces, names, flames, the house, the orchard, my own bedroom from childhood. A key, a journal, a mirror, and then a shape formed in the center of the light. A tree, upside down. Its roots extended skyward, its branches burrowed into the pool. I heard a voice, not whispering now, but calm and plain. You may speak your name, or you may speak the truth. I didn't know the difference anymore. My voice shook, but I answered. I remember. The light pulsed. The tree unfolded, slowly lowering until the roots kissed the water's edge. And then the water rose, not to drown me, not to wash me away, but to receive me. I was not submerged. I was absorbed. The chamber faded. The journal appeared again in my hands. Blank pages. And on the first line, Thomas 18, stormbound. I understood, finally. This wasn't a house that haunted. It was a house that recorded. It didn't seek fear. It sought witness. And now I was part of the record. I turned the page, dipped my hand into the light, and began to write. The storm arrived with no warning, no thunder, no flash of sky. It began with stillness, a a stillness so complete it scraped against the skin like fine glass. The orchard stood in unnatural silence, each tree locked in place as if bracing for something that had already begun. The blossoms that had coated the branches of the apple tree were gone, vanished like breath from a mirror. In their place, long black cords hung from the limbs, roots turned inside out, writhing softly like hair drifting underwater. I watched them sway, though no wind moved. I knew without knowing that this was the opening the journal had spoken of. The orchard had remembered. I stepped out of the tree's hidden tunnel, back into the gray light of a world that no longer resembled the one I had entered. The sky churned but held no clouds. The house had changed again, subtly. The porch was gone. The windows had grown taller. The chimney now bent slightly left, as if the spine of the house had been adjusted. The field between the orchard and the door had widened, or perhaps I had become smaller. Everything seemed to breathe in slow, subterranean rhythms, ground rising, air tightening, trees humming. The world didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a mind. The journal, still warm in my hands, bore fresh ink on a new page. Follow the procession. I looked around, expecting to see people, or shapes at least. But nothing moved. Not until I saw the soil shift at the edge of the orchard. A hand emerged, thin, dry, gray as bark. Another followed, then a shoulder, then a head crowned in moss. One by one they rose, 6 of them, figures in funeral clothing, soaked in soil but clean beneath it. Their movements were not jerky or ghostly. They stood with intention, with memory. The 7th figure had no face. A veil covered where eyes should be, but I knew it. I had seen the veil in the mirrored chamber, in my own reflection. The figure held something in both hands. I recognized it immediately. A locket, rusted shut. I had seen it in the alcoves below the house. The relics, the offerings, these were their owners. The figures did not speak, but they turned in unison and began to walk, not toward the house, but around it, circling. Their feet never quite touched the ground. Where they stepped, the grass blackened, then regrew behind them, leaving no trail. I followed. Each turn around the house brought change. On the first circuit, the paint peeled entirely from the siding, revealing a black timber skeleton beneath. On the second, the roof buckled slightly inward. On the third, the windows blinked briefly, like eyes adjusting to light. I lost track after that. Time in the procession was a ribbon cut loose, curling in windless air. Then, without signal, the figures stopped. We stood before the front door. It opened on its own. Inside, the house was full of sound. Not whispers, breathing. Dozens, maybe hundreds of lungs working together in rhythm, exhaling slowly into every corner of every room. I stepped inside, and the sound softened, as though the house had exhaled just for me. The figures entered behind me, one by one, then disappeared into the walls. The veiled one remained, standing in the center of the foyer beneath the chandelier that had never worked. Slowly, she lifted the locket and opened it. Inside, instead of a photo, was a slip of paper. She handed it to me. It read, "Say the name that isn't yours." I didn't understand. Then I did. "Thomas," I said. The name hung in the air like smoke. The lights flared. Every window in the house shattered inward. Wind poured through the seams of the walls, not from outside, but from within. Dust spiraled into the air, coating everything in the fine ash of memory. The house groaned once, a deep wooden moan that rose from the foundation. I staggered back as the floorboards peeled apart in a slow, spiraling pattern, revealing a staircase descending into a void of gray light. The veiled figure turned and walked to the edge of the opening, then stepped down into the dark. I followed. Each step downward felt like walking through water. The light thickened, clinging to my arms and face. The staircase ended in a chamber I had not seen before. The storm's mouth. It was vast and circular, its ceiling a dome of root and stone. The walls were made of mirrors, but none of them reflected me. Each showed a version of the house, some decayed, some ablaze, some frozen in mid-collapse. At the center stood a pedestal, and on it a mask. The mask was carved from wood older than any tree I had seen. Smooth, blank, no eyes, no mouth, just the shape of a face waiting to be worn. Beneath it, a final page from a journal. Not mine, but familiar. The handwriting was Thomas's, whoever he had been before me. It read, "One always stays. One always remembers. One always wears the mask." The veiled figure stood beside the pedestal now. She lifted her hands to her own face and removed her veil. Beneath it, no features, just blankness. She had already forgotten herself. She handed me the mask. I didn't resist. I took it. It was heavier than I expected. It trembled slightly in my hands, humming with the weight of every name it had absorbed. The pedestal pulsed once. The chamber dimmed. I put it on. Darkness. Not the absence of light. The presence of everything hidden. Inside the mask, I could see again. The house. The orchard. The rooms. The mirrors. The storm. And beyond all of it, the watchers. They stood at the edges of memory, silent and still, waiting for the record to complete. I saw my journal, now shelved among the others. Thomas 18. Stormbound. Witness complete. And then the voice came again. Soft. Pleased. It is time. The voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, its tone neither male nor female, ancient yet untouched by time. It is time. Not a demand. Not even an announcement. A simple truth, spoken like gravity, like erosion, like dusk arriving in the bones. The mask clung to my skin now, no longer resting on me, but sinking into me, its weight no longer physical but woven into thought. I did not try to remove it. The thought of separation had already been forgotten. It belonged to me in the way that scars do, earned, unnamed, irreversible. Around me, the storm's mouth pulsed. The mirrored walls shimmered with movement, but the house was no longer what they showed. It had unraveled. Its shape had broken down into gestures, into loops of memory. The reflection of the front door repeated again and again, slamming shut, opening for no one, standing still while someone passed it unseen. Hallways curled inward like teeth. Rooms blinked in and out of existence. The parlor burned and rebuilt itself over and over, flickering between time signatures. I understood now that the house didn't just hold memory. It was memory. Structured grief. A design of repeating burdens. A home grown from obligation. The veiled figure stood by the pedestal still, though the veil had never returned to her face. Her features remained smooth, featureless. Her head bowed slightly as though listening to the roots themselves. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had finished her part. She was no longer one who remembered, nor one who recorded. She had been released. But I was only now beginning. The voice echoed again, closer now. It is time to witness. The light shifted, narrowing, focusing into a single tunnel of golden shadow that led out of the chamber and upward. I stepped toward it, the mask guiding my breath, my balance, my sight. The first step forward felt like returning to a place I'd never seen. My foot touched ground that hadn't existed a second earlier, and behind me, the pedestal vanished. The chamber sealed. I walked. The tunnel curved like the inside of a ribcage, the walls pulsing with a slow rhythm. Every few steps, I passed a window, thin slits of vision through which I saw slices of time. A boy chasing fireflies. A woman boarding up a pantry door. A man weeping in the orchard with one hand pressed to the soil. These were not strangers. I knew them. Not by name, not by history, but by burden. Each had worn a mask before me. Each had followed the same narrowing path. I passed a final window and entered a room identical to the first I had ever seen in the house. The kitchen. The walls the same faded green. The table, the chipped mug, the closed pantry. But everything was still. Not just inanimate, but paused. I stepped around a table, touched the back of the wooden chair. Warm. Waiting. The journal appeared on the countertop the way it had that first day. The first page read in my hand, July 10th, the deed has been signed. But below that, in fresh ink, July 19th, he becomes what the house requires. The mask pulsed. I turned toward the pantry door. The iron latch that had once felt so ominous now looked inevitable. There was no fear left. Just clarity. I undid the latch and opened the door. This time the stairs led not downward but upward, impossibly so. I climbed. The staircase bent sharply, then again, defying the shape of the house. The higher I went, the more the light changed, from amber to red to violet to something that didn't exist on the visible spectrum. My hands blurred at the edges. My breath tasted of paper and ash. At the top of the stairs, I emerged into a long hall of doors. Each one bore a name. Each one bore a year. I passed them in silence. Eliza Maddox, 1883, William Falling, 1922, Claire Durham, 1946. Others I didn't recognize but felt like I had always known. The doors stood shut, but I could hear whispers behind each, soft recountings, pages turning, rituals replayed. Each name was a chapter. Each room a ledger. Each one of them had been Thomas. At the end of the hallway, one final door. Unlabeled. I reached for the handle and stopped. The mask tightened around my face, not painfully, but with intent. I understood. This was not a room to observe. This was the room where I would remain, where I would speak to those who came next, where my voice would carry forward, into the wood, into the walls, into the cracks of the pantry and the grooves of the staircase. I opened the door. Inside was a chair, desk, a window that looked onto nothing but fog, and on the desk a new journal. Blank. The moment I stepped into the room, the fog beyond the window lifted. I saw the house again, not as it was, but as it would be. I saw a car arrive, a figure step out, hands holding a deed, a key, a suitcase. I saw their face, familiar but not mine. Another witness, another Thomas. And in that moment, the final truth rooted itself in me like a seed breaking through loam. We do not haunt the house. The house haunts through us. We are not the curse. We are the chorus. I sat down. I opened the journal, and I began to write. The journal opened without resistance, paper thick and softly textured, untouched by time yet ancient in its intention. I didn't hesitate. I placed the tip of the pen, black and heavy, identical to the one that had appeared beside the typewriter in the earlier room, onto the first page and began. July 20th, the record continues. The ink sank into the page like blood into cloth, and I felt the room shift as I wrote. It was subtle, like the soft creak of a house stretching in its foundations. The desk hummed beneath my fingers, as if each word written reactivated something beneath it. Gears, nerves, a circulatory system of memory long dormant but never dead. I did not need to decide what to write. The sentences came to me like breath, automatic, involuntary. I recorded the journey not as I had lived it, but as the house had observed it. My footsteps through the orchard, the veiled figures, the hidden room with the hooks, the storm's arrival. But it was not a recollection in the human sense. There was no emotion, no embellishment. The house required facts, not for understanding, but for continuity. I was not the first to sit here, and I would not be the last. As I turned each page, the journal grew heavier in my lap, not with mass, but with consequence. My handwriting darkened, became sharper, more rigid. The house was refining my voice even as I gave it shape. I wrote about the boy in the hallway mirror, the note in the mailbox. The moment I realized the mask wasn't a symbol, but a function. The house didn't need symbols. It needed structure, repeatable ritual, predictable variables. And every Thomas before me had played their part with chilling regularity. The only difference between us was how long it took each of us to stop asking why and start asking when. I paused after 50 pages, though it could have been 1 hour or 100. The pen lifted from the paper as though pulled gently by unseen fingers. I leaned back and closed the journal. The window in front of me had begun to shift again. The fog thinned, and through it I saw the road leading to the farmhouse. Truck now. Not mine. Not yet. But soon. The figure inside the truck was indistinct, blurry with potential. They had not yet become who they needed to be. They had not yet touched the latch on the pantry door or stare into the mirror that refused to reflect. But they would. The pattern demanded it. The house was already learning their rhythm, their voice. I felt it moving beneath the floorboards of this room, shifting weight, adjusting angles, softening creaks where they would one day step. It was preparing. The whispering resumed. Not in the air, in my chest. My own voice, layered over itself 1,000 times, echoing back at me from a deep internal distance. Not spoken, but remembered. I heard myself say the name Thomas over and over, each time with a slightly different inflection. I was no longer a man who had accepted the name. I was a vessel that had spoken it so many times it no longer held meaning. The house had worn it smooth like a stone in water. The door to my room creaked open, though I had locked it, or thought I had. Standing in the doorway was one of the watchers. Not veiled this time. No mask. No robes. Just a plain suit, gray and threadbare. His face was not unfamiliar. He looked like someone I had passed on the street 100 times without recognition. That was his power. He was designed to disappear into the backdrop of memory. "You've written well," he said. His voice was soft, nearly brittle. "Thank you," I replied. He stepped into the room and stood beside the desk, placing a hand gently on the cover of the journal. "It will be stored now, and your words will echo." "Am I finished?" I asked, unsure of what I wanted the answer to be. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked at me with eyes that had seen too many rooms like this one. "You are recorded," he said, "but you are not gone." The journal lifted from the desk by unseen force, hovering in the air between us for a moment before vanishing entirely, sucked backward into the spine of the house like breath into a lung. "You will linger," the man continued. "You will whisper. You will open doors, close curtains, hum the walls. You will be all the little things someone notices but can't explain." I nodded. I understood. "You are the trace," he said. "The part left behind. Until the next." He turned, walked back to the door. "Until the next," he confirmed. And then he was gone. The door closed. The window fogged over again. The journal was gone, and the pen with it. I stood. The room accepted my movement. I crossed to the wall, placed my hand against the wood paneling, and felt the vibrations of the house's breath. Somewhere below, the root chamber throbbed with light. Somewhere above, the orchard swayed without wind. Somewhere in the library, my story had been filed between Thomas 17 and the blank space awaiting Thomas 19. I stepped through the door. The hallway was empty, but not silent. I could hear the whispers of other Thomases, dozens, maybe hundreds, each recounting their paths, their fears, their confessions. The sound was not chaotic. It was liturgical. A cathedral made of memory, each voice a lit candle. I followed the hallway to the staircase and descended. Not to leave, but to wait. The house no longer needed to chase me. I was part of its gravity now. I would stand beside the mirror. I would write new names into the margins of empty books. I would greet the next with silence, and when they knocked, I would answer. The house stood quiet again, the storm having receded not outward but inward, absorbed like breath held between rituals. I no longer walked it as a man seeking answers. I moved as an echo does, measured, weightless, repeated. The floors did not creak beneath my feet anymore. The mirrors no longer resisted. The walls knew me. I had become part of their language, written into the margins between basement beams and attic insulation. Somewhere, the figure in the truck had parked. The next name would arrive soon. But not yet. There was one final piece of record keeping. A ledger not bound in leather or ink, but in voice. The house has a memory, yes, but it also has a mouth. And tonight it would speak. I descended back to the chamber beneath the orchard where the inverted tree once touched the pool of light. The roots no longer glowed. They had dimmed to a dull brown, still pulsing but slower content. In the center of the room was a second chair. I had never seen it before. It was smaller, its shape uneven, like it had been grown rather than built. Across from it sat a child. His legs swung slightly, not reaching the floor. His hands were clasped, resting in his lap. He did not wear a mask, but his face was partially obscured, smudged at the edges, as though memory had not yet decided how clearly to draw him. He looked up at me with recognition that didn't belong to time. He knew me, or would, or already had. That no longer mattered. "You wrote it all down," he said softly. "Yes," I replied. "Did it help?" "No." He nodded like he'd expected that. "But it was necessary," I added. "I know." We sat in silence for a while. The house exhaled around us. "I used to be afraid of this place," he said, not looking at me, but at the ceiling, where roots twisted in shapes like calligraphy. "Before I saw it, I heard stories. From my dad. From his journals. From people who only whispered when they thought I was asleep. Everyone's afraid of it, I told him. Even the ones who think they're not. He looked at me then. His eyes were a pale gray. No shine to them. As though they'd already seen too much light. Did you ever want to leave? I thought for a moment. Yes, at the beginning. And now, there's nowhere to go. He didn't flinch at that. Just nodded again. You know who I am? I said, not a question. He opened his hands and revealed the locket. The same one the veiled figure had held. The one from the alcoves. Inside, I knew without looking, was a name. Thomas 19, he said and handed it to me. The weight of the locket changed as soon as I touched it. Cold at first, then warm, then neutral, as if trying on different temperatures until it matched me. I opened it. The paper inside no longer bore a message. Instead, it had begun to bleed with ink. One letter at a time, the child's name appeared. Not Thomas, his true name, the name he had not yet spoken aloud in the house. I read it, and for a moment I remembered who I had been before all of this. He waited. Do you want to know what happens next? I asked him. He shook his head. No, I want to feel it. He stood. The house reacted. Roots shifted. The ceiling opened into a perfect circle of daylight. Not gray light, not storm. True daylight. For a moment, it was beautiful. Almost gentle. It'll hurt, won't it? He asked, stepping toward the spiral stairs that had risen from the floor. Yes, I said, but only until you forget what pain is. He climbed. His feet didn't echo on the steps. The daylight held its shape as he rose into it. Just before he vanished through the opening, he turned and looked down at me. Will you be here when I come back? Yes, that was the promise. He vanished. The roots sealed behind him. The room returned to dusk, and I sat again. This was the final part of the ritual. The remembering before the forgetting. The exchange. I reached into the desk beside the chair. A new journal waited inside, already titled, already numbered. But the pages were not empty. The boy's handwriting had begun, crude, careful, hesitant. The first line read, "There's something wrong with the house." Then, I heard breathing in the walls. Then, "The apple tree has black flowers." Then, "I think it's inside me." I ran my hand down the page, not to edit or erase, but to bless. The entries would become clearer, sharper, stranger. As the house shaped him, his voice would match its corridors. He would fight it for a while. Then he would investigate. Then he would confess. Then he would write. And when the last page was filled, he would sit in the chair. He would meet the next child. He would be me. I stood again. The chamber darkened. The mask pulled tighter to remind me it was not a costume but a role. The next storm was years away, but the sky was already tasting salt. Somewhere, thunder dreamed in silence. I left the root chamber and returned to the house. Every door opened for me now. Every mirror showed me exactly as I was, an accumulation, not a person. A witness-shaped wound, preserved in wood and silence. The child had begun. The house would continue, and I would remain, listening. The house has no final room. It has no final breath. It ends only where the memory refuses to continue, and memory here is infinite. I no longer know how many days have passed since I first stepped onto the porch with a deed in my hand. Time here is not a calendar, but a rhythm. A deep, pulsing rhythm that moves like roots below frost-hardened soil. The boy, Thomas 19, has begun to forget his own name. His entries come more frequently now. The handwriting sharpens. The phrasing narrows. He's asking fewer questions. He's begun to write in passive voice. It was open. It was heard. It was chosen. The house is shaping him, sanding down the edges of individual will until all that's left is the soft curve of obedience. I remember that curve. I wear it still. Today, he found the cutout portrait in the parlor. The one with the children's faces removed. The same photograph I saw on my third day. The same one I later found fully restored, only to learn the faces were waiting to become me. Today, he touched the edge of the paper and flinched. I felt it. His fear doesn't belong only to him anymore. It echoes up the walls, through the beams, into the dark hallways where names hover in the corners like dust motes. I followed him through the house in silence. He did not see me. That is the rule. I am here only to witness now. My footsteps fall behind his never before. My breath moves through different rooms. When he sleeps, I walk the orchard. When he reads, I listen from beneath the floorboards. I am the timing that makes things creak when the room is empty. I am the silence just after he whispers his own name to see if it still belongs to him. He is close. He is so close. And the house knows it. It has started shifting again. The basement door refuses to stay closed. The mirrors have begun to ripple even when no one passes. The veiled figure has appeared in the corner of the attic, standing where sunlight cannot reach. Her face remains blank. She no longer moves. That is how the house tells us the end is near, not with violence, but with stillness. All things slow down before they are absorbed. I remember when it happened to me. I remember the moment I stopped feeling out of place. That's the most dangerous part. Not the screams, not the blood, but these. The moment you walk into the hallway and realize the house no longer confuses you. The moment the locked door stays locked and you say, of course. The moment the whisperer knows your name and you answer like it's a friend. Thomas, 19, stands at the threshold. He found the iron hooks today. He stared at them for a long time, but he didn't cry. He didn't run. He just nodded. That's how I know the house has chosen him. It doesn't need to chase the ones who've already accepted their part. Tonight, he will dream of the orchard blooming in winter. He will walk barefoot through black snow. The apple tree will speak in his own voice. And when he wakes, the basement stairs will be new again. The pool of light will welcome him. And he will be ready. I return to the root chamber alone. I do that often now, when I need to remind myself that I once had questions. The chair still waits. The pedestal still bears the impression where the mask once rested. I sit and stare at the ceiling. Sometimes I see the tree above me, inverted and breathing. Other times I see faces. Not just mine, but all of them. All the Thomases. Their expressions caught mid-thought, as if they died still trying to understand the last sentence they wrote. I am no longer curious. I no longer want to know what this place is. It is not a riddle to be solved. It is a story that demands retelling. A confession spoken in generations. The house is the altar. We are the psalms. The thunder has returned. Not loud yet, just the faint cracking sound that precedes a shift in temperature. It's early, I think. But then again, the house chooses its seasons without us. Time is elastic here. Rain falls upward when necessary. Fire doesn't burn unless asked to. The storm doesn't wait for permission. It watches the one who carries the journal. When the record is ready, the storm arrives to sanctify it. Thomas, 19, is almost there. I've begun to hear his thoughts drift into my own. Not clearly. Not like a voice in my head. More like a second heartbeat. We are aligning. That is how the mask chooses when to return. It tightens around me, quietly. Not to harm. Just to remind me, I will wear it again. I will step forward. I will speak to the one who sits in the chair. I will hand over the locket. I will whisper the words I once feared. It is time, and I will watch the new name appear on the paper. Not Thomas. Not truly. But something close enough to matter. When that happens, I will leave this voice behind. I will become the creak again, the hum in the walls, the slow closing of the cellar door, and the new record will begin. But until then, I wait. I listen. The boy is climbing the stairs. The journal is half full. The mirrors have begun to reflect backwards, and the storm has opened its eye. I close my own. The house breathes in. We are ready.